She didn't say hello. The first words out of my daughter-in-law's mouth were, "Did you transfer the money yet?" Not "good morning." Not "how are you feeling, Richard?" Just, "Did you transfer the money yet?" I was standing in my kitchen. The coffee was still brewing. I hadn't even sat down. I said no, I hadn't. I told her I was still waiting on the invoice she promised to send 2 weeks ago. She said she'd resend it. Then she hung up. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand, looking out the window at the backyard. The oak tree my wife and I planted the year our son was born was starting to lose its leaves. October does that. Strips everything down until you can see the shape of things clearly. I should have seen the shape of things a long time ago. My son's name is Daniel. He's 34 years old, and for most of those years I was proud of him in the way a father is proud when a child turns out decent. He was thoughtful as a kid, quiet. He used to sit at the kitchen table while I paid bills and ask me how money worked. I'd explain it to him. Checking accounts, savings, interest, the difference between spending and investing. He'd nod like he was filing it away. He became a physical therapist, built a good reputation. His patients liked him. His colleagues respected him. 3 years ago, he told me he wanted to open his own practice. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table where he used to watch me pay bills, and he laid it all out. The location he'd found in a professional plaza about 20 minutes from their house, the equipment he'd need, the build-out costs, the working capital to survive the first 18 months before insurance reimbursements caught up. He had a business plan. He'd done his homework. I read through the whole thing. It was solid. The total he needed was $310,000. He asked if I could help. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a wealthy man. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county. I have a pension, Social Security, and a retirement account I spent 3 decades building carefully. My wife Margaret passed 6 years ago, and after the medical bills and the funeral and the estate, what I had left was enough to live comfortably if I was smart about it. Not lavish. Comfortable. $300,000 was more than half of what I had. I told Daniel I needed a few days to think. I talked to my financial advisor. I talked to my brother in Portland. I sat in the backyard at night and thought about Margaret, what she would have said. She was the practical one. She would have said to write up an agreement. She would have said to write up an agreement. She would have said to protect yourself. But she also would have said that family is family. I called Daniel and told him yes. I told him I wanted it structured as a loan, not a gift. He agreed immediately. I thought that meant something. I thought the fact that he agreed without arguing showed respect, that he understood the weight of what I was doing. We shook hands. We said we'd have something drawn up. We never did. That was my mistake. I know that now. But at the time, shaking hands with my own son felt like enough. He was the boy who used to ask me how money worked. I thought he already knew. His wife's name is Cassandra. She came into his life about 5 years ago, right around the time Daniel finished his clinical hours and got his license. She was sharp and organized, and she had strong opinions about how things should be done. Daniel seemed to like that about her. She settled him, he said. I tried. I want to be fair about that. I went to their house for holidays. I brought things when they asked. When their daughter was born 2 years ago, I drove 4 hours to be there, and I stayed for a week to help. Cassandra and I were never warm with each other, but I thought we had a workable distance. Civil. Respectful enough. After I agreed to the loan, things shifted. Not dramatically, just the temperature changed. Cassandra started being the one who called, not Daniel. She started managing the communication, which contractor they'd hired, which equipment supplier they were going with, timelines, progress updates. It all came to her, and it came in the tone of someone reporting upward to a board member they considered a nuisance. I didn't say anything. I told myself she was just organized. I told myself Daniel was busy with patient care and she was handling the administrative side. I told myself a lot of things. They broke ground in March. By July, the build-out was nearly done. I asked twice about coming to see the space. The first time, Cassandra said it wasn't a good time. They were in the middle of inspections. The second time, she said they'd let me know when it was ready. I waited. August came and went. I sent Daniel a text asking how things were progressing. He replied with a thumbs up emoji. A thumbs up emoji. After $310,000. In September, Cassandra called again about another transfer. There had been unexpected costs, something about the HVAC system failing the first inspection, and a required upgrade to the electrical panel. She said they needed an additional $22,000. I asked if I could see the estimates. She said she'd send them over. She never did. I transferred the money. I told myself it was almost done. I told myself once the practice opened and patients started coming in, the tension would ease. Everything would normalize. Then I called Daniel in early October to ask about the grand opening. I wanted to know the date. I wanted to put it on my calendar. I wanted to be there. He didn't pick up. I tried again the next morning. Voicemail. I sent a text. Nothing. 3 days later, Cassandra called. She asked if I had transferred the money yet. I said, "What money?" We spoke about the HVACs. I transferred that weeks ago. She said there were additional billing cycle costs. She'd sent an invoice. Did I get it? I said I hadn't received anything. She said she'd resend it. I said, "Cassandra, before we talk about another transfer, I want to know, when is the grand opening?" There was a pause. Then she said, "The opening was last month, Richard. We had a small gathering, just immediate family and close friends. It was nothing formal." I didn't say anything for a moment. Last month. The practice had already opened. There had been a gathering, and I, the man who had put in $310,000, who had given more than half his retirement savings, who had watched his thing go from a business plan on a kitchen table to a real building with a sign on the door, I had not been invited. I said, "I see." She said, "So did you get the invoice?" I said I'd look into it. I hung up. I sat down in the chair by the window, the one I've had for 20 years, the one Margaret used to read in. I looked at the oak tree. I didn't move for a long time. I want to explain what that moment felt like, because I think people assume that when something like this happens, you explode. You call back and raise your voice and demand answers. That's what anger looks like in the movies. What I felt wasn't quite anger. Not at first. It was something colder and more disorienting. The feeling of realizing that the picture you've been looking at isn't what you thought it was. That you've been standing in a room and calling it one thing, and it's been something else entirely. I thought about the thumbs up emoji. I thought about the missed calls and the voicemails that never got returned. I thought about the $22,000 wire that went out with no documentation, no estimates, nothing in writing. I thought about the shaking of hands instead of signing a piece of paper. And I thought about the invoice she'd mentioned. Twice now, an invoice for costs I hadn't agreed to sent to an address she may or may not have gotten right, in a pattern that had started to look less like disorganization and more like something else. I didn't call back that day. I needed to think clearly, and I couldn't do that if I was reacting. I called my brother first. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is something he's always been good at. When I finished, he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Rich, you need to pull every wire transfer record you have and sit down with somebody who can look at this properly." He was right. The next morning, I called my bank. I asked for documentation on every outgoing transfer I'd made in the past 3 years that had gone to accounts associated with Daniel or the practice. They sent me a full accounting within 2 days. Then I called a business attorney, a woman named Patricia who had done some work for our county office years ago and who I trusted. I explained the situation. She said the first thing I needed to do was determine exactly where the money had gone, not just the total, but each transfer, what account it went to, and whether those accounts were in Daniel's name, the practice's name, or something else. Something else. She said those 2 words carefully. I understood why. I spent a week gathering everything I could. Bank statements. The text messages. The emails from Cassandra with the payment requests. The one invoice she had actually sent, back in the spring for the initial build-out phase. I printed all of it and put it in a folder. Then I looked up the practice on the state's business registration database. I found the LLC. It had been registered 8 months ago. The registered agent was a company I didn't recognize. The managing member listed was not Daniel. It was Cassandra. I sat with that for a long time. Then I kept looking. I found a second LLC, newer, registered just 4 months ago. A holding company. It owned the lease on the property. The same property I had helped fund. The managing member of that company was also Cassandra. I called Patricia and told her what I'd found. She wasn't surprised in the way that told me she had half expected it. She explained what this likely meant. That the assets of the practice, the lease, possibly the equipment, had been structured in a way that effectively removed Daniel as a principal and certainly removed me as any kind of stakeholder. My loan, which had never been formalized in writing, existed only as a handshake and a series of wire transfers that could be characterized any number of ways. She said the $22,000 I'd sent in September had gone to an account registered to the holding company, not to the practice itself. She said we had options, but the path forward depended on whether Daniel was a participant in this or a bystander. That was the question I'd been sitting with for days, and I didn't have an answer. I drove to the practice on a Wednesday morning. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. It was in a clean, professional plaza, the kind with the fountain out front and matching signage on all the suites. I parked and I sat in the car for a few minutes. I could see the name on the door from where I sat. My son's name in clean sans serif letters. Below it, a tagline about restoring movement and reclaiming life. There were patients inside. I could see movement through the glass. I went in. The receptionist was a young woman I'd never met. She smiled and asked if I had an appointment. I said I didn't. I was Daniel's father, and I was hoping to catch in between patients. She went to the back. A minute later, Daniel came out. He looked older. That probably sounds strange, but it struck me. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He shook my hand like I was someone he'd met at a conference, and asked if we could talk in one of the back offices. We sat down on opposite sides of a small desk. I didn't start with accusations. I had made a decision the night before about how I wanted to handle this, and I stuck to it. I placed a folder on the desk between us. I told him I had some questions I needed answered, and I was asking him directly because he was my son, and because I believed he deserved the chance to explain before I took any further steps. He looked at the folder. I asked him if he knew that the LLC registered for the practice listed Cassandra as sole managing member. He said she handled the business side of things. I asked him if he knew that a separate holding company controlled the lease, also under Cassandra's name. He looked at the wall. I asked him about the September transfer, the $22,000. I told him it had gone to the holding company's account, not the practice account. He said he'd have to look into that. I said, Daniel, I need you to be straight with me. Right now, not in a week. Right now. He put his hands on the desk and he looked at me. And for a moment, he looked like the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table asking how money worked. Tired and young at the same time. He said Cassandra had structured it the way she had for liability protection, that it was standard for small medical practices, that he hadn't been involved in the specifics. I said, did you know the practice had its opening last month and I was not invited? He looked down. He said she handled the guest list. I nodded slowly. I said, I need you to hear me clearly. I put $332,000 into this practice. That includes the September transfer. I have every wire record. I have documentation of every communication in which Cassandra made payment requests. My attorney has reviewed the corporate structure and the account routing. I am not angry, Daniel. I am telling you that I need a formal written agreement, a promissory note, a repayment schedule, and an accounting of where every dollar went within 30 days. If I don't have that, I will have no choice but to pursue this through every legal avenue available to me. He was quiet. I said, I would much rather we do this as family, but you have to understand, there's no version of this where I simply let it go. He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something. Then he just nodded again. I stood up and picked up the folder. I said, I'd like to hear from you this week. Not from Cassandra. From you. I walked out through the waiting room, past the patients with their intake forms, past the receptionist who smiled on my way out the same way she had on my way in. I got in my car. I sat there for a moment. The fountain in the plaza was running, catching the morning light. I drove home. Daniel called 4 days later. It was a Sunday evening. I was eating dinner and I almost didn't pick up because I told myself I wasn't going to chase him. I picked up. He talked for a long time. He told me things I'm not sure I'll ever fully process. About the dynamic in his marriage, about how decisions got made, about how he had told himself it was fine because the practice was doing well, and the money would be paid back and he didn't want to make things harder than they already were. I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I said, "I hear you, and we'll deal with all of that in time, but right now what I need is the agreement." He said he understood. He said he'd talked to a family attorney. He said Cassandra was resistant, but he was moving forward. I told him I was glad. There's a part of me, the part that has been his father for 34 years, that wanted to make it easier for him. To say it's fine, we'll figure it out, don't worry about Cassandra. That part of me wanted to fix it in the way I'd fixed things for him, his whole childhood, put my hand on his shoulder and say we're okay. But the other part, the part Margaret's practical voice lives in, knew that making it easy would have been the wrong thing. Not for me, for him. When children are not held to the weight of their choices, even grown children, they don't learn that the weight exists. They go on assuming someone will absorb it for them, and someday there will be no one left to do that. I told Daniel I loved him. I said that clearly and without condition. Then I said the agreement needed to be in my hands by the end of the month. The promissory note arrived on the 28th. Patricia reviewed it. There were things that needed to be adjusted. The repayment schedule was too loosely structured and one clause tried to characterize a portion of the transfer as a gift. We pushed back on that. It took another round. The final version was signed 6 weeks after I walked into that office. The $22,000 that had gone to the holding company was a separate matter. Patricia filed a demand letter on that. Cassandra's attorney responded. There was a negotiation. I'm not going to detail all of it, but I will say that the money was returned. Not quickly, not without resistance, but it came back. The practice is still open. Daniel is still working. We talk on the phone about once a week now. It's not what it was before. There's a carefulness to it, a formality that didn't used to be there. I think that will take time, maybe a long time. His daughter, my granddaughter, is almost 2. She has Margaret's eyes. I drove down last month and took her to the park and pushed her on the swings and she laughed at everything, the way children that age laugh at everything, with their whole body. That part is still intact. I think about what I would tell another parent sitting where I sat 3 years ago, listening to a child lay out a dream across a kitchen table. I wouldn't tell them not to help. That's not the lesson. The lesson is that love and documentation are not opposites. A promissory note is not a sign that you don't trust your child. It's a sign that you take the relationship seriously enough to protect it from the pressures that money creates, from the third parties who may not share your values, from the misunderstandings that grow in the absence of clarity, from the slow drift that happens when no one wrote anything down. A handshake means everything between two people who both honor it, but you cannot always know in advance who you're shaking hands with. My financial advisor is helping me rebuild the retirement account. It will take years. I won't get back to where I was, not fully, but I have the pension, and I have the house, and I have enough, and I have something I didn't have before, a clear picture of what things actually are. Not the picture I wanted, the real one. That's worth something too. I still sit in Margaret's chair by the window some mornings. The oak tree is bare now. It looks like it did last October when this all started, stripped down to its shape. But I know from 30 years of watching that tree that bare doesn't mean finished. It means it's storing what it needs for what comes next. I think about that when the mornings feel long, and then I make the coffee, and I get on with it. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not to replay it looking for a place to put the blame, I'm past that, but to understand how something like this is even possible. How a man can write a check for everything he spent 30 years building, hand it to his own son across a kitchen table, and end up standing outside a building with his name on nowhere. The honest answer is that I let the love do all the work. I trusted the feeling and skipped the structure. And when you do that, when you let affection substitute for clarity, you leave the door open for whatever else walks in. In my case, what walked in was Cassandra, with a spreadsheet and an agenda, and a very clear understanding of how to move money between entities that I hadn't even known existed. I don't say that to make her the villain of every chapter. People make choices, and those choices have consequences that follow them forward. What Cassandra did wasn't invisible. It was documented. It left a paper trail that a good attorney could follow, and Patricia did follow it, all the way to a returned wire and a signed agreement. That's how accountability works when you're paying attention, not through drama, through records. What I keep coming back to is Daniel, because Daniel wasn't a passive bystander. He knew more than he let on, and for a long time he chose comfort over honesty. He told himself the money would come back, that the structure was just liability protection, that he didn't want to make things harder than they already were. And I understand that impulse. I do. But understanding something and accepting it are different things. A man who watches an injustice happen from a close distance and says nothing is still responsible for the silence. Daniel had to learn that. I think, slowly, he is. What I learned is something I should have known at 63 better than I did. That clarity is an act of respect toward yourself, toward the other person, toward the relationship. When I shook Daniel's hand instead of signing a document, I told myself it was because I trusted him. But the truth is, it was also easier. A conversation about promissory notes and repayment schedules would have been uncomfortable, so I avoided it. And that avoidance cost me more than $332,000. It cost 2 years of distance with my son and a version of our relationship that I'm not sure we'll fully get back. Resilience isn't about not getting hurt. I got hurt. I sat in Margaret's chair for a long time on a Tuesday morning in October, and I felt it completely. Resilience is what you do after that. It's making the call to the bank. It's finding Patricia's number. It's driving to that plaza and walking through the door and placing the folder on the desk and speaking calmly to your son about things that are breaking your heart while you say them. It's choosing to stay clear when everything in you wants to either explode or collapse. I'm 66 years old. My retirement account is smaller than it should be. My son and I talk on Sundays, and there's a careful quality to it that wasn't there before. My granddaughter laughed on the swings last month like the world was made for her amusement, and I pushed her higher and thought, this is still here. This is still real. You build what you can with what remains. That's not resignation. That's just the honest work of a life.